Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Can rodents show empathy? Would a sperm whale really headbutt a whaling boat like in Moby Dick? Do ants rescue their injured comrades? Janaki Lenin explores this and dozens of fascinating stories in her latest book, Every Creature Has a Story. Janaki is a journalist, writer, filmmaker, and this is her fourth book. Janaki has also worked in conservation policy in India and internationally in various roles. Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. Janaki, thank you so much for joining us today to talk to us about your work and about your latest book.
Thank you, Pavan, for having me. It's indeed a pleasure to talk about the book and creatures and all the wonderful animals that live around us.
Absolutely. And it's my privilege to get to talk to so many people who work with animals in so many different capacities. And I love stories around them. And today I want to start off with the first story that you capture in your book on nightingales, especially the common nightingale in Europe. Could you tell us a little bit about the wonderful complexity of the nightingale songs? We'll also play a short clip for our listeners.
So as you mentioned, nightingales are European in origin. They are about the size of a robin. They're small birds. They don't look like anything. They're like brown, drab birds. But their song is spectacular. It has imbued European mythology and metaphor, no matter what language they speak. And it's this powerful thing for Europeans. And this bird spends its winters in Africa and it returns to Europe in spring and it immediately goes into the breeding season. And this is when the males sing at night to attract a female, and that's why they are called nightingales, because they sing at night. Now, singing, you wouldn't realize it watching the birds, but it's actually a very strenuous exercise. And the males that are singing their hearts out or even lose weight while they are singing. Once they attract a partner, that's just the beginning of all the hard work they have to do. Once she lays the eggs, she's just sitting, incubating her eggs, and they have to find food and feed the female. And once the eggs hatch, then the nestlings have to be fed. And then when they fledge, the female will often lay another batch of eggs. And so the male is like working himself to the bone, feeding all these young birds and his partner. And there is no question of a female doing any of this on her own. I mean, parenthood is not for single parents in nightingales. So before she commits to a relationship, how is she to know how good her partner will be? So researchers who analyze the song say that not only do nightingales' songs warn rivals of their territory and attract mates, but they're also advertising their dad potential. But what exactly about the song attracts females, that they haven't been able to untangle yet. But they think it's a combination of the entire repertoire of the male as well as the range, his vocal range, which includes everything from low to high pitch. And the thing is, the repertoire is phenomenal. Like, older, experienced male has a repertoire of about 200 songs. And the songs are incredibly complex. So a young male who's in the first year of his life hasn't had a chance to develop that full repertoire. His repertoire would probably be half the size of an older male. So a female who is in the breeding season trying to figure out which male is the best bet, when she hears a young male, she's going to say, oh, this guy is not quite there yet. And she's going to go to the next singing male to judge how good he is going to be. And that's how she apparently figures out how good a mate the male is going to be by listening to his songs.
Wow. So here I may ask, often, especially with birds, because they have such vivid either physical displays, dances, or songs like this, it's hard to know how that as a vehicle for, selecting a mate is linked to things like evolution and, finding a better mate and therefore having a better chance for your offspring, right? And perhaps the situation is very different in very different circumstances. There's this wonderful documentary on Netflix with Stephen Fry on the birds of paradise. And there it's this weird area where food is no longer an issue. And so each bird of paradise has a very complex evolution of dance and performance. So here there is a direct correlation that people have seen with the nightingales.
Yeah, we have a sort of equivalent to the birds of paradise in our peacocks. They have this ridiculous, extravagant tail which gets in the way of anything they would want to do. Like it would be a drag for flying. When they're walking through the forest, it's going to snag on things. So it's just aerodynamically the wrong tail that for a bird. And yet it's our national bird in its full glory. And, we have peahens to thank for it because they are the ones choosing males with these fantastic tails. And basically, why does a male jeopardize his survival? Like if he's going to be slow to take off, he's going to get, say, taken by a predator. Or, if he's going to be walking through the forest and his tail is getting snagged and tatty, that also slows him down. So it doesn't make any sense at all, survival sense. So essentially what he's advertising with his great fancy tail is that I have survived despite this. And I have to be good genes to do that. And essentially the females are using the tail as a proxy for good gene quality. And it's the same thing with nightingales. The females are putting pressure on the males to have this fantastic song repertoire. And so when they mate with a male with this great range, vocal range, their sons will inherit their father's singing ability and the daughters will inherit their mother's discerning ability. So over generations, you have this reinforcement of that choice. So it's like a selective pressure on the males to be good singers if they want to procreate. So that's how this works.
Wow, that's truly amazing. Do you think something like this might also apply to the common Asian koel? I'm asking because like the nightingale in Europe, I think the koel is one that is our constant companion at most nights, right? It's sometimes kept me from sleeping, sometimes woken me up earlier. I'll again play a little clip for our listeners as well. Do you think something similar might even work here?
It's possibly not because it's a cuckoo and it's a brood parasite. A brain fever bird lays its eggs in the nests of babblers. So it doesn't actually do any hard work at all. So the female is possibly just using his song to figure out how good his genes are for her young. I mean, she's not looking at how good a father he's going to be because that is completely taken care of by the babblers. So to that extent, there is little similarity. But when I was writing this piece, I was wondering about our magpie robins because they are incredible songsters. And I was wondering if the female magpie robin would use a male magpie robin song to gauge how good a father he'll be. And a funny thing happened in April, soon after lockdown. A pair moved into our bedroom and nested in one of the wall lamp fixtures. So I had a chance to actually observe their whole parenting, and it's not really as strenuous as it is for male nightingales. Like the female feeds herself, like she incubates the eggs, but she goes away for an hour or 2 hours in the morning to feed and then comes back and sits on the eggs. So the male isn't actually feeding her, and once the eggs hatch, then she takes over most of the job of feeding the young while the male is singing outside and chasing off predators. And he does some bit of feeding of the babies as well, but not nearly as much as the female. So I don't know if there is that much riding on a male magpie robin song even. The pressure is not as much on the male magpie robin as it is for a male nightingale.
And what I love about your stories, almost all of them that you capture in this book, is that you link good research, the latest research, you also credit the researchers, and you link that to our understanding of animal behavior, right? And I love that this is presented this way rather than, in textbooks where something is just presented as known knowledge that all of us ought to know. So can you tell us a little bit? I loved your story on chameleons and the work of scholars Katz and Katzir. I hope I'm pronouncing their names properly, at Haifa in Israel.
The thing about chameleons is the first thing that occurs to us about them is their ability to change color rapidly. And we don't really see their, funky eyes so much. We know that they go in different directions, seemingly, without any control. But how does it work? Like each eye is looking in a different direction and they're sort of bulgy, and the eye, you can't really see the eyes. All you see is one tiny little hole in the dome that is their eye. And so it was incredible to read this research because the way they found out what happens is really cool. So they had captive chameleons, and they trained them to use computer screens. So they had an animated insect, a little black thing with dangly legs, and they had this virtual insect, crawl across the screen, and the chameleons would watch this ant or whatever walk by, and then they added a complication to it. They split that insect in two and had it crawling in two different directions. And the chameleons, very naturally, one eye looked at one half of the insect and the other eye looked at the other half of the insect until they figured out which one they wanted. And then the moment they made that choice, they focused both their eyes on that particular part of the insect. And that to them suggested that the brain cannot actually process two images at the same time. So let's say in the real world, if one eye is watching a grasshopper in one branch and another eye is watching praying mantis in another branch, how does the brain then decide? It has only one tongue, so how is it going to catch what? So just before, it makes this decision. Does it want the praying mantis or the grasshopper? And once it makes the decision, brings the other eye that's looking at the praying mantis to focus on the grasshopper and shoots its tongue out.
So it's on-demand binocular vision, right? Unlike humans where we have binocular vision at all times, unless we close one eye.
Yeah, that's because our eyes are, coupled to each other. We cannot move one eye separately from the other. Whereas with chameleons, it seems to be completely dissociated, like one can look up and the other can look down. It seems to offer an incredible degree of independence. But they don't, each eye is binocular in a chameleon. They don't actually need to use both their eyes to focus. They can do it with one eye. It's only because of this practical problem of having one tongue, one mouth, that they have to bring the other eye around to the same object before they can shoot that tongue out and grab the prey. So it's really crazy stuff. But when you look at a chameleon, you have to wonder, like, how does it do this? And now we have the answer.
That's incredible. And I love that people are exploring these questions actively so that we can tell better stories to people who come after us, right? Because we've heard of the stories, we've seen the stories of chameleons changing color, but now we have an actual explanation for how they do what they do. So, Janaki, while writing, how do you navigate the challenge of anthropomorphization, right? So now the chameleon that we discussed is quite far removed from humans and higher mammals and so on, and their brain and their thinking patterns can be quite different. And it's very easy for us to sort of imbue human-like motivations, right? Be it for our pet cats or dogs, be it for various animals. And in some cases, this is actually true. So how do you explore it when you write your stories, including in this book?
Okay, this is an interesting question, and I really am struggling to answer it because I don't think I avoid anthropomorphization. I think it's probably an apostasy to say that. I draw human analogies whenever and wherever I can, because without it, it's hard for readers to relate to what I'm talking about. I mean, very often these creatures, like we're talking about chameleons, and I don't know how many people have ever seen one in real life. And that's just one example. And there are a great many number of species that most people wouldn't have seen. So how do you make them relate to that creature and empathize with its problems? So I freely and happily use human analogies. I'm probably going to get tarred for saying that, but I think as long as I'm not misrepresenting and I'm accurate within reasonable limits. I mean, I'm willing to swing a little bit this way or that way to push the facts a little bit to make a story possible. I'm willing to do that. And I think another thing I do is also that I take a lesson from acting, the method acting. You inhabit the character. So I kind of become that creature for a while with all its limitations. Maybe it's blind, maybe it can't see further than its nose, and it's got to find its prey. How does it do it? And there is no light in the forest floor. So how does a creature like that survive? That is a fundamental question. So when you inhabit that and you describe all those limitations and then you bring in these problems, I think readers will by proxy inhabit that creature as well. And all these, like when I was talking about the chameleon, did it seem like this crazy, weird looking creature to you? You were just going along with how does this creature do this? How its eyes are moving in different direction. It might have seemed weird at first, but then you accept that as the reality and you go the next step. So how does this work? How does the brain process these two images? How does it even hunt? So you get caught up in all those questions that you forget about what it looks like, or whether it is weird or not, or whether I'm anthropomorphizing, or I think it's a complicated but simple answer, if you know what I mean.
And Janaki, no, my takeaway was that anthropomorphization is usually when you imbue the animal with human tendencies, right? And in certain cases that might actually be true. But what you're telling me is that instead of making that animal human, it's about taking us humans into the animal skin. And I think that's a fantastic way to look at it. And I think it can represent a far wider variety of truths than what only the former can. But over here, I also want, perhaps maybe you could quickly mention a few stories that you capture in your book where there are genuine human-like challenges or human emotions that some animals display, right? I mean, you mention chimpanzees grieving. You talk about, I think, prairie voles, a type of rodents that can show empathy. This is just endlessly fascinating to me.
This is my favorite subject, I think, because I'm just so delighted. We for centuries have set ourselves as superior to the rest of animal kingdom. And now when we look at it more closely and study their behavior, we are realizing that actually, they might have whatever we have prided ourselves on, which is empathy and altruism and stuff like that. So this is really something that I take great delight in, the fact that, the animals have been doing whatever they've been doing for centuries, but research is now breaking down those barriers and showing us that what we thought were essentially human qualities can also be found in animals. And empathy is like a heavy duty thing, because you're showing compassion to another creature of your own kind that has been through a bad time. Or chimpanzees, death is a heavy subject, and we know that they grieve. We've seen even bonnet macaques and rhesus macaques in our cities and towns dragging along the corpse of a dead baby around for days and days. And it's disturbing at the same time, but to see them do that. But whether it is grieving or not was always up in the air. Some people were saying, it's just, even though it's not moving, the mother thinks it's still her baby, so she is trying to carry it around as she would real life baby. So it's very hard I think the research is not quite there yet. But there are other fun things like how do ants deal with old age? Do their faculties fade, as happens in humans and many other creatures? If you are a social creature like humans or even ants, and if you have a whole structure of living and functioning built around a social life, how do some humans exploit it and can not do their part and can drag their feet and not do their part of the work? They can be lazy and essentially exploit the system. And it happens in ants also. But I think that was really fun for me to see, to look at human societies and animal societies and see these parallels in fun ways, not just in heavy duty ways like death and grieving or, terrible pain and suffering and empathy. And there was also this other thing about voting. I had the greatest fun writing about this African wild dogs, which are also a group living, they live in a pack, and they all have to go out hunting. What if some of them don't want to go hunting? How do they decide to go hunting at the same time? And apparently they vote. They take a vote. So they have to have a certain quorum of sneezes. They vote by sneezing, sort of an achoo. And the researchers haven't quite decided how many votes it requires to take a decision. But the higher you are in the hierarchy means you don't need, one vote is equivalent to X number of junior members' votes. We don't quite know that yet, but the essential fact is that they are voting to take a decision, which, I was very delighted to read that.
So, Janaki, what about dealing with topics that are sometimes very, very alien to humans? Say, for example, we deeply frown upon cannibalism in human society, obviously. We are deeply disconcerted by the idea of parasites. But these are things that are very common in nature, right? There are spiders which, while they are growing up, eat their brothers and sisters sometimes, and there are so many behaviors in nature that can seem like a gigantic shock to humans. So when you're dealing with it, how do you write about it? How do you, again, make this interesting rather than ghastly, which is, I think, an unfortunate trend that we see in some form of both writing and especially television on nature?
Okay, so I don't have a straight answer to this because it's something I struggle with as well. Basic thing is animals are what they are for a very good reason. You can't take a moral angle on their behavior, or vice versa. When we had that 377 being discussed about legalizing homosexuality, they were saying, even animals don't behave like this. It works both ways. So you can't justify I mean, you can't take lessons from human behavior and apply it to animals in the moral sense, or take lessons from animals and apply it to humans. It's just a difficult thing to do because you have everything from infanticide to cannibalism to everything happening in the animal kingdom. I think the way at least I deal with it is to try and find out why does it happen. Like more than the recent case was actually with king cobras in Agumbe. There have been at least 3 or 4 instances of a male king cobra swallowing a female king cobra. And one was during the breeding season, one was at the end of the breeding season. From the beginning, I've always wondered why king cobras are snake eaters. There has got to be an identity confusion at some point, like in breeding season when they're meeting mates and fighting rivals. Is there any possibility of confusion? Do they ever confuse one another of, say, a rat snake, which is a male, or a male or a female king cobra? One is a rival and the other is a mate. So how does this work? And at that time, when I first asked these questions 30 years ago, there were set answers that in many snakes, the hormonal change at the beginning of the breeding season puts the males off food. So they don't feel hungry. They just want to mate during the breeding season. And which makes a lot of sense for a snake-eating snake to go off food. It takes care of the problem. And they also have these different displays they do to recognize each other. So the female, when she's approached by a male, will keep her head low to the ground and spread her hood. And there's like a chevron marking on the back of her hood that she displays to the male. And then she covers her head in these coils, and it moves so fast that the bands seem to go forward and backward. You don't know which way the body is moving. That's how fast she goes. So she does this very specific display which indicates to a male king cobra that it's a female king cobra and not a rat snake. So it seemed like, there can't be a mistake. But then we've had these recent cases of cannibalism, and we've been trying to answer why. How does it make sense for a male king cobra to swallow a female king cobra? Because she is the key to producing the next generation. Without her, how are you going to have eggs? And in one traumatic case, the female was building a nest. She was just hours from laying her eggs when a male showed up. He had followed her scent trail, went round and round the nest, and she was so involved in gathering up leaves to make a nest, and she's the only species of snake to do that. When she finally realized that there was this male around, she just split. But he grabbed her and swallowed her. That's it. It was just so traumatic for everyone watching it, because we watched these snakes as part of the research project, and you would develop this bond. I mean, if you see a creature every day, no matter how alien it is, you begin to develop this relationship. You know this creature, you know its habits, you know it's going to wake up at this time, it's going to go out and bask in the sun at this time, and at this time it's going to go drink water. So you know its routine, you know its personality, you know it as a creature. And to have it suddenly die like that was just heartbreaking. So it's something we struggle with. We don't have an answer yet, but we can't moralize how animals behave by using our lens. We've got to understand it from their point of view. Why does this work?
So, Janaki, what you mentioned also illustrates this well, right? Through your book, you feature research from scholars around the world. In a few cases, you also feature scholars from India. For example, you mentioned K.S. Sheshadri's work. He's at Atri, who's studying frogs and how the male parent of frog eggs will try and defend it against other frogs who might try to eat the eggs and so on. So do you think we are in a better position today in 2020 in India to tell some of these stories better about animal life in our own country compared to where we were 20 or 30 years ago?
Absolutely. I think it's an incredible time to be alive right now for me. I'm just so excited by all the research that's happening. I think with frogs especially, I really love the work Seshadri does, and also Guru Raja, who's mentioned in that story, because for a long time, the only kind of work that was happening with frogs was taxonomy, like figuring out which is a species, which is different from that species, or taking one species and making them several different species. So they were mostly concerned about, different features, body features, structures, the length of the toe compared to the wideness of the mouth or the width between the eyes. So they do all these things to figure out if one species is different from another or not. And a lot of that was what research in smaller reptiles was all about for so many years. But it's really nice now to see actual behavioral work happening to show how these frogs breed. Like when I was in school, it was very standard. Frogs lay eggs, tadpoles hatch out, and then they metamorphose into froglets, which have a tail, and then they lose their tail and become frogs. That's what we studied in school. Now there's a whole class of frogs in our own literal backyards, which hatch out of eggs as frogs. There's no tadpole stage, no, tail between the legs, none of that. So it just is amazing to find all these incredible little creatures that are in our own country. I think it's not just restricted to frogs alone. Like there's fantastic leatherbacked sea turtle work happening in the Andaman Islands with Karthik Shankar. Deepak Veerapan did a study with cane turtles in Anamalai Tiger Reserve to see what they eat, how far they travel. I mean, things we didn't know before. Or even Samira Agnihotri, who studies the calls of racket-tailed drongos. They mimic everything. Literally, like other birds, mammals. In some populations, they mimic truck engines.
I think there have been a few viral clips that have been going around on social media in the recent past about drongos.
Yeah, so why would a bird want to do that? Like, what purpose does it serve? These really charming stories that these researchers have started telling, and it's really amazing time. I mean, I can't stress that enough. For a person like me, this is just the best.
Thanks, Janaki. And so do you think that sometimes in India, though, we end up talking more about the loss of our environment and the need for conservation, while we sort of either assume or ignore nature appreciation? I'm asking because typically I come across way more articles and op-eds and laments written on environmental destruction and the lack of conservation. And all of that is definitely true, but far fewer that take time to appreciate nature and inculcate that appreciation for nature.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I often feel guilty for not writing about the loss of wild habitats and wild species. It almost seems like I'm being self-indulgent in writing about animal behavior and nature writing, that sort of stuff. So it's the way you framed it kind of places importance on the nature appreciation in the writing part. So thank you for that. We are justified in paying more attention to the loss because this is relentless, right? Like every year seems to be worse than the previous year. And now we have this horrible draft EIA that's being proposed, and we have this dam coming up in the Dibang River in Arunachal Pradesh, and then right in my backyard in Vedantangal Wildlife Sanctuary, there is a attempt to denotify a part of it for a pharmaceutical company. So these every year it seems to be getting worse and worse. So in a way we are justified in paying this kind of attention. In recent years, I've been wondering if, although there is so much attention being paid, are there more voices for conservation now than, say, 4 decades ago or 5 decades ago? What is the percentage of the population that is concerned about our natural heritage? I'm not really sure. I mean, there seems to be a lot of noise in social media and in the media now, but is that an indication of how popular or how concerned the general public is to these issues? I'm not really sure, but I think in my conversations with people, this is completely anecdotal. The moment I start talking about Italan Dam, people's eyes just glaze over. They don't want to hear about, some lunatic wanting to stop development, quote unquote, for nature. And I'm seeing what I'm writing, the wonders of nature, trying to make animal behavior much more personable and something people can relate to, about nature writing and other instances, as a bridge for people who don't have that connection to the natural world to build that connection. And I think it's really important. And I think in a way, without that, we are not going to build a constituency for protecting our natural heritage.
You echo one of our former guests, Harini Nagendra, when she was talking, I think in episode 21 of this podcast about rewilding our cities. And it was very similar. What you mentioned about building that constituency of people who care about the environment really resonates with me, because I think if we take that for granted and then advocate for an environmental cause, like you said, many eyes might glaze over. But if people feel for some of these animals whose habitats might be destroyed, who might connect, be it with a tarantula or with a tiger, I think we have a better shot at achieving some of those conservation goals as well.
Like you remember for Silent Valley in the 1970s, when the people against the dam were protesting, the pro-dam lobby was saying, oh, it's either monkeys or humans or something like that. It shouldn't be that binary. What people who are fighting for the natural world are fighting for is for everyone. It's not as if it's beneficial just to one small group of people. It's if we could live without nature, if we could, drink any old dirty water and survive, and if we could not need air purifiers in Delhi, we could completely then divorce ourselves from nature, but we can't. We are still the creatures of this planet, and we need to rely on the products of nature to survive as a people, as a species. Without it, we can't. So we're going to have to recognize this as how essential it is to our survival and well-being.
Janaki, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks and talking to us about Every Creature Has a Story. And dear listeners, I cannot recommend Janaki's book and her writings enough. They're a delight to read. It's a privilege that I got to read it before recording today. You can find links to her works in the episode description on the Bangalore International Center website for this episode. Janaki, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.